alien princess terrified to marry ruthless human until seeing him up close. The vast halls of the Imperial Zirakian Palace shimmered under a dome of artificial stars, casting a pale celestial glow across marbled floors and crystalline spires. But no beauty in that opulent chamber could calm the storm raging in Princess Selya's chest as she stood beside her mother, Queen Aurela, in front of the gathered High Council and the watchful eyes of the galaxy. She was the last royal daughter of Zirak Prime, heir to a bloodline that had ruled for thousands of rotations, her silver-laced skin and luminous lavender eyes, marking her unmistakably as the true-born of the House of Illyri. Yet despite her noble birth, her finely honed diplomacy, her knowledge of history and interstellar law, her mastery of 7 languages and 3 forms of energy manipulation, she had no say in the one decision that would define her life forever: who she was to marry. Her hands trembled slightly, fingers curling into the folds of her ceremonial gown as the Queen's voice, regal and clear, carried across the chamber. The House of Illyri and the Terran High Command will unite in peace, bound through matrimony, between Princess Selya of Zirak Prime and General Damian Kale of Earth. The air stilled as though the palace itself were holding its breath, then burst into a cacophony of whispers, gasps, and stunned expressions. But all Selya could hear was the rushing blood in her ears, and the single repeated phrase echoing in her mind: General Damian Kale, the ruthless Terran warlord, the human butcher of Kalian Ridge, the man whose name was spoken in her diplomatic classes as a cautionary tale of unchecked aggression, the man rumored to have no heart, no mercy, no soul, only a hunger for conquest. The terror she felt wasn't petty or naive. It was survival instinct, deeply ingrained by everything she had learned about humans and about him in particular. She had seen his face only once, in a heavily redacted security file, and even that left her breathless, not from attraction but from the sheer coldness of his gaze, a stare like forged steel tempered by fire, with eyes that could strip a person of secrets, dignity, and possibly even life, all without blinking. He had dark features, scarred skin from battles fought without armor, and a reputation for never negotiating twice. Why would her mother, the most calculating queen in centuries, send her only daughter into the clutches of such a creature? For peace? Selya doubted peace could be won with such a brutal man. As the council adjourned and courtiers dispersed, her mother approached her, voice low but firm. "Do not judge the wolf by the tales told by frightened sheep," Queen Aurela said, fixing her daughter with a knowing gaze. "You see ruthlessness, but I see what may be the only man capable of standing beside you, not above you." Selya swallowed her protest. She had learned long ago that arguing with her mother was like trying to bend starlight. It could not be done. But that night in her chambers, staring out across the bioluminescent gardens of Zirak Prime, she allowed herself to cry. Not as a princess, but as a girl stripped of choice, staring down a future with a man she feared and despised. The following days passed in a blur of preparations, media frenzies and diplomatic briefings, but Selya felt as though she moved through a dream. No, a nightmare, where she smiled and nodded while her soul curled inward in dread. Then came the message. The Terran vessel Vengeance Breaker had arrived in orbit. Her betrothed was here. The ceremonial meeting would occur in less than 1 rotation. Her attendants fluttered around her like silver-winged moths, adorning her with the symbols of her house, braiding her moon-pale hair with ancestral gems, painting her face with glittering ceremonial inks, but none of it made her feel more prepared. She was being led to the observation platform when the ship descended, a monstrous angular silhouette against the violet skies, black as obsidian and twice as ominous. Its engines roared like the scream of a dying star, vibrating through the stone walls, and for a moment she imagined running, escape, hiding, disappearing into the lower districts and never looking back. But duty was a collar around her throat, unyielding. She took a deep breath, held her head high, and waited as the ship's boarding ramp lowered. The moment General Damian Kale emerged, flanked by Terran guards in armor like living shadows, the entire court hushed. Selya's heart stuttered. He was taller than she imagined, built like a creature carved from storm clouds and flame, every movement precise and predatory. He wore no crown, no ornament, only a military uniform lined with rank stripes and war medals, none of which mattered compared to the storm behind his eyes. And yet, he was not what she expected. His expression was unreadable, his posture respectful, not domineering. There was no smirk, no challenge, no arrogant swagger. When he stepped forward and bowed, it was not mocking, it was measured, deliberate. "Princess Selya," he said, his voice low and controlled, not warm, but not cruel, either. "It is an honor." She struggled for words, caught off guard by the absence of hostility. "General Kale," she managed, voice steady though her pulse raced. "You do not seem as terrifying as I imagined." A flicker, just a hint of amusement ghosted across his face. "You are not the first to say that," he replied, "but I prefer not to correct the myths. They serve their purpose." His honesty disarmed her more than threats would have. It was her first glimpse that beneath the armor, beneath the rumors, was a man who understood the currency of fear and chose to wield it strategically. That did not make him safe, but it made him intelligent. And intelligence, she knew, could be negotiated with. The formalities proceeded, introductions, toasts, declarations, but all the while Selya found herself watching him more closely, observing the subtle tension in his jaw, the way he always knew where every guard stood, the slight softening of his stance when speaking to her, as though trying, awkwardly perhaps, to present something less than lethal. He made no attempt to flatter her, no empty compliments. But when she referenced a Zirakian philosopher during a toast, he responded with a quote from the same scholar, in perfect dialect. It was the first time in days her lips parted in something close to a real smile. She did not trust him, not yet. But neither could she maintain the image of a mindless butcher in the face of a man who seemed to carry the burden of command like a cloak of iron. That night, when she returned to her chambers, she did not cry. Instead, she sat before her star map and traced the constellations between Earth and Zirak Prime, wondering what kind of stars shaped a man like Damien Kale and what they had in store for her. Perhaps fear was not the only thing this union would bring. Perhaps, just perhaps, the universe was far more complicated than she had dared to believe. The days following their first meeting unfolded like a delicately layered negotiation between two empires, two ideologies, and two hearts too guarded to bear themselves, yet too curious to stay closed, as Princess Selya and General Damien Kale were thrust into a whirlwind of ceremonial obligations, unity trials, and diplomatic theatrics carefully choreographed by both the Zirakian High Council and the Terran Alliance Command. But it was in the quiet moments, those stolen fragments of silence between the grand performances, that Selya began to sense that the man behind the myth was not made of war alone. Their first private conversation took place in the Solarium of Echoes, a luminous chamber where ancient Zirakian crystals resonated with the thoughts and emotions of those who entered, and tradition held that only truth could be spoken within its sphere, for lies would be echoed back in distortion. She did not expect Damien to agree to such a test, but he did so without hesitation, and when he stepped into the chamber with his heavy boots echoing against the crystal floor, he said nothing for a long moment, merely observed the swirling light with something akin to wonder, until he finally turned to her and said, "Do you hate this union as much as I feared?" The question, so direct, so unadorned, disarmed her, and though instinct told her to offer a political response, the chamber demanded honesty, so she answered softly, "I feared you, but I do not hate you. Not anymore." The light shimmered, gently, confirming her truth, and she watched with careful curiosity as a flicker of emotion, perhaps surprise or maybe relief, passed across his guarded expression, as though he too had expected nothing but contempt from her. They spoke for hours beneath the refracted light, not of politics or peace treaties, but of childhoods and memories, of what it meant to be born into power neither of them had chosen, and Selya learned of Damien's upbringing in the war-scarred sectors of post-Earth reconstruction, where loyalty was survival and compassion could be mistaken for weakness, where he had lost both parents before he was old enough to understand. Griffin had risen through the ranks not because he wanted glory, but because leadership was the only way to protect others from the chaos he had survived. In return, she told him of growing up in a palace where silence was strategy, and affection was rationed like breath in the vacuum of space. How she had once dreamed of exploring the galaxy not as royalty but as a scholar, nameless and free, until her destiny had been carved into stone by forces beyond her control. And in the sharing of these truths, something shifted, a bridge forming not yet of trust, but of mutual understanding. Still, the galaxy watched, and appearances had to be maintained, so they danced the dance of diplomacy with elegance and precision, smiling before cameras, exchanging rehearsed glances, participating in trials designed to demonstrate unity, the binding of hands in the ritual of flames, the dual wielding in the ceremony of defense, the recitation of oaths before the galactic witnesses. But within each staged event, Damien surprised her again and again with small, quiet gestures of respect that only she noticed. The way he always let her speak first, the subtle glance of concern when she tripped on her ceremonial robes, the unspoken solidarity he offered. When the council elders scrutinized her every word, one night, during the Festival of Twin Moons, a Zirakian celebration of harmony where lanterns were released into the skies bearing the hopes of the people, Selya and Damien were tasked with releasing the first pair, their joined hands symbolizing the future of their alliance. And as they stood before thousands of watchers, their fingers brushed and the lantern rose, luminous and weightless, drifting upward as a chorus of wishes followed it into the stars. She turned to him then, compelled by something she didn't fully understand, and whispered, "What did you wish for?" And he did not smile, but his voice was quiet when he replied, "That you will never regret this union." Her heart stuttered at the sincerity in his tone, and for the first time, the fear that had gripped her so tightly since the announcement began to loosen its hold, replaced not with love, no, not yet, but with the seed of possibility, fragile and real. But not all were pleased with this unfolding closeness. Whispers began to circulate among the Zirakian elite, subtle shifts in court behavior, cold smiles and sharper tones, and even Queen Aurelia, though unreadable, seemed to watch her daughter more intently, as if weighing the cost of the union not just in political terms, but in something deeper, perhaps even maternal. Tensions came to a head during a closed council meeting when one of the older Zirakian advisors dared to question Damien's loyalty aloud, citing his record of violent campaigns and the Terran history of conquest. And before Selya could speak, Damien stood, his voice calm but cutting as he listed every colony he had refused to invade, every civilian life he had spared despite military orders, every time he had disobeyed cruelty in favor of calculated mercy, not out of sentiment, but principle. And when he concluded, "Do not mistake silence for weakness or restraint for lack of capability," even the doubters quieted. But what struck Selya most was not the strength in his voice, but the pain just beneath it, the weariness of a man who had spent his life proving he was more than his reputation, and still found himself judged by ghosts. That night, she found herself wandering the Hall of Ancestors, alone until she heard his footsteps behind her, and without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she touched him not out of duty, but choice. His fingers closed around hers, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence louder than any speech. "I see you," she whispered at last, and his eyes met hers, not cold, not cruel, but profoundly human. "And I you," he said. From that night forward, something bloomed between them, still delicate but undeniably alive. The whispers grew louder, as alliances within the court shifted, some fearing what a union built on more than strategy might mean for their own influence, and threats began to slither from the shadows. Nothing overt, just the kind of subtle sabotage only those trained in diplomacy could detect. Miscommunications, delay tactics, attempts to ignite tension between Terran and Zirakian delegates. Damien, ever the soldier, noticed immediately and increased his own private guard around Selya, though he never told her directly, not wishing to alarm her. But she noticed the pattern, the way he was always near when something seemed off, always watching. Eventually, she confronted him and he admitted his concerns not with fear but calm resolve. "Someone does not want this union to succeed," he said. "Not because they doubt us, but because they believe we're growing too close." And it was in that moment Selya realized the truth. What had begun as fear had transformed into something far more dangerous: attachment. She was beginning to care. And with caring came risk, but also hope. And perhaps even love. Selya had grown up believing that love was either a weakness to be conquered or a luxury reserved for those not born beneath the crushing weight of crowns and planetary alliances. But as the days stretched into weeks and the facade of obligation slowly peeled away to reveal something startlingly sincere between her and Damien, she realized she had never truly understood what it meant to be seen. Not through her lineage, not through her responsibilities, but as a person, a soul, a woman. And as this fragile thread of connection began to weave tighter between them, she began to fear it more than she had feared him at the start, because now she was no longer battling a stranger's cruelty, but her own longing, a hunger for something real in a life that had never allowed her to want anything for herself. And Damien, for all his silence and shadowed past, was proving to be more steadfast than any nobleman she had ever known. His loyalty not earned by rank but by experience, by watching him defend her without words, by noticing how his presence turned the cold halls of the Zirakian Palace into places she could finally breathe. But of course the galaxy was watching, and where hope bloomed, danger was never far behind. The first assassination attempt came during the Unity Feast, disguised as a ceremonial toast, the poison laced so subtly in her goblet that not even the scanners detected it. But Damien had insisted on switching their drinks moments before the first sip, and though he made light of it, though he waved off the medics and grunted that he had tasted worse in Terran training camps, Selya saw the way his fingers trembled slightly, the sheen of cold sweat at his brow, and something broke inside her, something deeper than fear, a primal fury laced with guilt that someone would dare harm him, her intended, her protector, her companion, not for what he had done, but for what he meant to her. The investigation was swift, and while no culprit was officially named, the whispers pointed inward, toward the Zirakian court itself, where dissent simmered beneath jeweled robes and false smiles, and Selya, for the first time in her life, stood before the High Council not as a daughter nor a pawn but as a flame, demanding justice not in the name of diplomacy, but for the man who had nearly died, shielding her from a fate she had resigned herself to facing alone. Her voice that day was not soft nor deferential. It cracked through the crystalline chambers with the fury of every silenced generation before her. And Damien, watching from the side with a bandaged hand and steady eyes, did not try to stop her, did not try to soften her words. He simply watched, with something like awe, and later, when they were alone in her quarters, he spoke only 4 words that sent her breath from her lungs. "You were magnificent, Selya." And she, uncertain how to hold the storm in her chest, kissed him. It was not planned, not ceremonial, not diplomatic. It was instinctual, raw, a collision of trust and fear and affection, and a desperate need to feel alive. And though Damien tensed at first, surprised he did not pull away. And when his arms closed around her, it was not possession but reverence, as if she were something sacred he did not yet believe he deserved. And in that moment, she knew her heart had made a decision long before her mind ever could. But love in a palace of politics is a dangerous thing. And the next attack was not physical but emotional, a leak to the intergalactic press of Damien's most brutal campaign records, taken out of context, painted with the blood of enemies, to make him a monster again in the eyes of those who needed a reason to oppose the Union, and public opinion trembled, with protests erupting on both planets, the alliance teetering under the weight of centuries of fear and historical wounds. And suddenly they were no longer just a couple in waiting, but symbols of everything the galaxy feared: change, unity, and redemption. Damien withdrew, not from her, but from the spotlight, refusing interviews, turning down speaking engagements. And Selya saw through him more clearly than ever before. saw that this silence was not shame but control, a man refusing to let others dictate his narrative. And when she stood before the United Front Assembly and spoke of what he had endured, what he had sacrificed, and how his so-called ruthlessness had saved more lives than it had taken, she turned every weapon forged against him into a sword she wielded in his defense, and the galaxy slowly, uneasily began to listen. Then came the journey to Terra, where she was to meet the human people, not just their leaders but the citizens, the ones who would have to accept a Zirakian queen if peace were to ever hold. And as their ship entered Earth's orbit, Damien took her hand, not ceremonially, not for the cameras, but in silent reassurance, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a way that grounded her more than gravity ever could. And when they descended and walked into the courtyard of New Earth capital together, the cheers that rose were not thunderous but real, hesitant at first, then rising as she bowed, not out of submission, but respect, and spoke of the future they were building, a future where love did not weaken rulers but strengthened nations. During that visit, she met Damien's old commander, an aging war hero who walked with a limp and stared at her as if unsure whether she was a dream or a threat. And after a long pause, he said, "I've never seen the general look at anyone like that, not even the stars." And Selya smiled, understanding in that moment that love, when earned through fire, is not fragile, but forged. And though the past would never vanish, it no longer had the power to dictate who they would become. But the final test came unexpectedly, a crisis at the border of Zirakian space where a rogue faction, opposed to the Union, seized a moon and declared war, daring Selya to choose her people or her promise. And it was Damien who stopped her from boarding the assault cruiser, not by command but by kneeling, not as a soldier but a man in love, and saying, "This isn't your battle to fight alone anymore." And together they led the mission side by side, not as a princess and a general, but as two warriors who refused to let history repeat itself. And when the dust settled and the moon was reclaimed without a single civilian casualty, the galaxy finally saw what love forged in trust could accomplish. When they returned, the palace was silent, not with doubt, but awe, and Queen Aurelia, who had never spoken more than caution since the betrothal, finally bowed her head and whispered, "You have proven what even I dared not hope." The wedding day dawned not in silence but in the hum of anticipation that reverberated across two worlds suspended in fragile unity, the skies of both Terra and Zirak pulsing with the soft glow of peace embassies, floating news drones, and orbital security wings circling like watchful doves as if the galaxy itself held its breath, unsure if what was about to unfold was prophecy or the last fragile dream of mad idealists. And in the palace gardens where once only political bargains bloomed, now stood arches of starlight crystal draped in iridescent flora from both planets. Earth's moonflowers unfolding beside Zirak's radiant flame vine. And among them walked a woman who once trembled at the name Damien Kane, now clad not in armor of duty but in a gown spun from the same woven stardust threads her ancestors wore in coronation. Except this was no coronation of title. It was one of love, raw and undeserved, and yet somehow earned through 100 silent sacrifices, 1,000 hidden kindnesses, and one soul who saw her not as a tool of diplomacy or symbol of hope, but simply as Selya and Damien, the so-called ruthless general, the terror of 100 battlefield legends, waited at the altar with his once battle-hardened hands slightly trembling, not because of fear but because every moment he had lived until this point had been a storm. And she was the calm after it. Not the ending of a war, but the beginning of something neither of them had dared to believe in. Peace, not just between people, but within themselves. The ceremony was witnessed by leaders and commoners alike, broadcast across worlds, and while protocols were upheld, royal hand salutes, bonding rites, the traditional symbolic unity flame lit by both their palms, it was the moment their eyes met that made the galaxy shift. Not because of grandeur or spectacle, but because it was so achingly human, so devastatingly real, that even those who once scoffed at the match found their breath stolen, because there was no calculation in their gaze, only history, shared, painful, healing. And when the officiant declared them bound by oath and will, Damien didn't hesitate to pull her into A kiss that silenced even the most cynical commentators. And later, as they stood on the balcony before the twin moons, the people of both Terra and Zirak chanting their names not in fear or resentment, but in hope, Selya leaned into him and whispered, "We did this." And Damien, resting his forehead against hers, murmured, "No, you did. You taught me how to believe again. But peace, like glass, is beautiful only when protected, and the days that followed were not without hardship, for factions still grumbled in the dark, attempting to sow doubt, and old enemies, now masked as advisors, whispered poison at court. Edges, and yet every time shadows tried to creep in, the two stood shoulder to shoulder, not in perfection but in unity. And slowly, the tides turned, not by force but by presence, because where Damien walked, he no longer brought fear but discipline cloaked in compassion, and where Selya ruled she did not reign from above but among, her feet often seen wandering the common halls of the palace, hand in hand with the people who once looked at her through fear-tinted eyes, and together they redefined what power meant. On the one-year anniversary of their union, the council proposed the long-feared integration treaty, the true joining of both civilizations under shared law, shared trade, shared defense. And while many hesitated, the memory of that wedding day, of the battles survived and the peace held, gave weight to the impossible, and after heated debates and sleepless nights, the treaty passed by majority, not because of politics but because of trust. And when Damien stepped up to sign beside her, the room fell silent as the Terran military seal touched the royal Zirakian crest, ink drying like a promise made in fire and sealed in faith. That night, as celebrations erupted across cities and skies, Selya and Damien didn't attend the galas or galactic broadcasts. They returned instead to the quiet garden where they had first truly spoken without pretense, beneath the starshade, tree whose leaves shimmered when touched by two hearts at peace, and there they sat, no longer soldier and princess but man and woman, scarred and sacred, broken and rebuilt. And Selya took his hand, still calloused from a life of war, and pressed it to her belly, eyes glistening as she whispered, "There's a heartbeat, ours." And Damien, who had faced death without blinking, felt tears gather in the corners of his eyes, because for the first time in a life filled with chaos, he wasn't just protecting a world, he was part of one.